Diane Ravitch is the president and co-founder of the Network for Public Education. She is a historian of education and research professor of education at New York University. Diane blogs at dianeravitch.net, and her blog is close to surpassing 36 million hits. She has written 11 books, including her latest book, Slaying Goliath. Julian Vasquez Heilig is the Dean and Professor of Education Policy Studies and Evaluation at the University of Kentucky College of Education. He is one of the founding board members of the Network for Public Education. Julian obtained his PhD in Education Administration and Policy Analysis and a master's in sociology from Stanford University. His research is both informative and outstanding. Julian blogs at Cloaking Inequity, consistently rated one of the top 50 education websites in the world by Teach 100. Julian and Diane, welcome.
Thank you so much, Carol. It's a great pleasure to be on tonight with Julian Vasquez Heilig. I was trying to remember when I first met Julian, and I think the first time was at the very first meeting of the Network for Public Education. And Julian, of course, is one of our founding board members. And our first annual meeting was held at the University of Texas. And at that time, Julian was a faculty member at the University of Texas at Austin. And I remember going out for a barbecue. He indulged my passion for Texas barbecue. And it was only then that I discovered that Julian is a vegetarian. And I can't think of anything more painful than to be a vegetarian at a barbecue restaurant in Texas. But he was a good sport, and I think he had a lot of coleslaw. But Julian has been an amazing activist, and I've learned so much from him. I love reading his blog, in part because he always has the most amazing graphics. And if you've read my blog, you know that I almost never have graphics, and I usually turn to someone else to put the graphics on because I just don't know how to do them, and I haven't taken the time. I am a person of the word. Julian is a person of both word and graphics, and his blog, Cloaking Inequity, has been amazing over the years. After he was at the University of Texas, he then went to Cal State, and he became the leader, the president of the Education Committee, if I have the correct title, of the Education Committee of the NAACP in California, where he made a huge national impact by his role there. So some of us had mixed feelings when he became the dean at the University of Kentucky School of Education. But on the other hand, while he's leaving the action in California, he's in one of the really hot spots in red Kentucky. So the educators across the state of Kentucky have been very upset about what the governor and the legislature, not this governor, but the previous governor and the legislature have done to teachers' pensions. And there has been a huge teacher movement to roll back some of the attacks on the teaching profession. So he has jumped right into the frying pan. He left a very comfortable position. And I know you're all eager to hear from Julian. So Julian, with that, I would like to ask you to talk about how you came to be Julian Vasquez Heilig. And I know that you have some association with the University of Michigan, and you're always cheering on their football team. So please tell us about yourself to begin with.
Sure, I'd love to do that. Welcome everyone to this podcast, and those watching in perpetuity. I'm Julian Vasquez Heilig. So glad to meet each of you in this virtual forum and to have this conversation with Diane Ravitch. So the way Diane and I first came to know each other is I published an article about the Texas social studies standards and the representation of people of color in those standards. And so I sent that article to Diane, and that started the dialogue. And one day she said, I'd like you to come to Brooklyn and sit on my sofa and talk about creating a new grassroots organization, an alliance of academics and civil rights advocates and community activists and many others and said yes. And of course, the rest is history. The Network for Public Education. A little bit about myself. I was born in Michigan. I was actually born in the University of Michigan Hospital. My parents attended the University of Michigan, so my blood is blue. Now, I'm at the University of Kentucky, so my blood is a different color blue than it was maybe a year ago. And I attended the University of Michigan. I did a master's in education. Then I ended up in Houston, in the middle of what was then called the Texas Miracle, in the middle of high stakes testing and accountability, working for Rod Page, who later became the Secretary of Education. What was happening in the district, I thought required a lot more investigation. I wanted to understand what was going on with Latinx and African-American youth in that district. And I ended up at Stanford working with Linda Darling Hammond. So some of you out there, that probably explains a lot. She trained me. She trained me to do this really important work on behalf of communities of color and tackle inequality in the research that I do. So my main research is focused on the thread of inequality in the education system in the United States, looking at high stakes testing, accountability, charter schools, school vouchers, many of those things. But the work that I'm probably most proud of right now is the work that focuses on engaging communities in education reform and in education policy, instead of the top-down, external privatization, private management conversation that's been happening the last 15 years or so, and even as far back as Friedman in the 1950s, of course. But that's the work probably I'm most proud of, is the work on community-based education policy.
So Julian, tell us about what some of your hopes are at the University of Kentucky. How do you see yourself as a change maker, and what attracted you to this position?
Well, you know, we as academic leaders and education leaders more broadly, superintendents, principals, educators, we're facing an unprecedented confluence of events. So not only are we facing a worldwide pandemic, but we're facing the financial realities in education as a result of those. And how do we deliver education in distance formats and what the fall looks like? So that's all been challenging. But then within the last 3 or 4 weeks, you see an important emerging conversation. You see communities in the streets asking for addressing police brutality. But not just that, the economic realities of our nation. If you listen to the protesters, there's quite a few conversations that are happening in these peaceful protests as we go into our, I think, 4th week of these protests. So we as educational leaders, I think, have a responsibility to respond. I think that historically, you see education leaders more authoritative and bureaucratic in their approaches to leading, whether it be superintendents, whether it be academic leaders, etc. I think these confluence of events really require us to choose leaders that are community engaged and community relevant, those that can build coalitions and build consensus. I think that is what this time period, the moment that we are in the history of this nation, requires of our education leaders. So I've worked really hard to engage our stakeholders. For example, we're working on a new Black Lives Matter in academia approach for our college. I first went to our Black faculty. About a little over 11% of our faculty are African American here at UK, and said, first, how are you feeling? Second, what more can we do right now? Now, I feel as if the College of Education had been preparing for this moment. We had spent a year around different social justice initiatives. We believe that 67% of the faculty that we hire this year will be people of color. We believe that 1/3 of those will be African American. We're still trying to close a couple of the deals. We've been working really hard to create a new civil rights initiative here at the University of Kentucky. So stay tuned. I can't give you many details on that yet, but we've been working on that since last July. And so we've been going through this process, talking with our stakeholders, the things that we've been doing, and trying to understand what more we can do. Going to the leaders of the college. Next, I'm meeting with our students. We've created an advisory committee of 36 students that want to provide input on what we can do more as educators for social justice and for Black lives and for other groups of color. And we expect in this next year to be able to execute an agenda. And I think we should have those expectations for our superintendents. I think we should have those expectations for our principals, for our teachers. I think we should have expectations of this community engaged work around social justice in corporate America, in our policymakers. Now's the time where we need to demand of our leaders that they enact, because I think these statements that you see, those are important, but actions are powerful. So words important, actions powerful. So that's what we're really focused on at the University of Kentucky. We're focusing on action. Action in the short term, midterm, and long term, because I believe when the students come back to campuses across the United States, primarily I'm talking higher ed campuses, that they're gonna want to know that their leaders have been preparing all summer plans to enact social justice approaches for students and faculty in the communities that we serve. And so that's what we're engaged in right now. So we're working on civil rights work, we're working on work taking care of our own house, making sure that we're promoting diversity among our students and our faculty, and that we're also engaging our faculty in the important discussions around social justice nationally, encouraging our faculty to do that, highlighting when our faculty, for example, Candace Hargens, just tonight, was on national TV, one of our professors, talking about the racialization of policy in education. So we want to be leaders. You know, the University of Kentucky is at its crest right now. We have our highest national ranking we've ever had, top 30 among public, and we expect to make a difference. That's what wakes me up in the morning, Diane, is making a difference for children. And that's what I love about being an educator, is that the work that we do leaves a permanent legacy for families.
Julian, I'm curious to know, across the country, over the past few years, there has been a dramatic decline in the number of people going into education programs, which I personally attribute to the attacks on the teaching profession that have been a result of this so-called reform movement, where teachers are blamed for low achievement, teachers are blamed for poverty, teachers are blamed for whatever goes wrong in children's lives. And I wonder, what's happened in Kentucky? Have your enrollment suffered as a result of this national climate of disparaging teachers?
They absolutely have. If you look at the public institutions across the state, you see declining enrollments. And it's not just Kentucky, it's many other states. So that was something, pardon?
It's every state.
Yes, no, absolutely. And some of those problems were particularly acute here in Kentucky for the reasons that you talked about at the start of this call, really the politicization of education and of educators. But I have some good news for you, Diane. I think you know me to be energetic. I think you know that we're really committed to changing paradigms. I think I'm known as an innovator. I think that education leaders, their office should be the place where good ideas go to thrive. And so we've said no to every good idea said yes. We said yes to every good idea that our faculty have brought to us, that our staff have brought to us. I'm gonna tell you, Diane, I asked our recruiter today, the UK College of Education, our enrollment is up 15%. And I think that's unheard of. On campus, there's only one other college, considering the circumstances that we're in, that has increased their enrollment. And we've done that by telling the story of educators. Right now, we are creating what you could call a reality show about our first year teachers that will be on Snapchat in the fall. We've used social media, blogs, traditional media to tell the story of education. And I think Generation, if you look at the research on Generation Z, they are really committed to making a difference. I think that's one characteristic that many folks have identified about their generation. And that fits right into a career of being an educator. And so we're just really proud. I told the provost the other day that we tripled the number of STEM teachers. we went from 7 to 25 in our freshman class. And that's because we're going to the places where educators are, future educators are, these young folks, communicating them with on social media and telling them how important it is and how important they are to us to come join us. I found myself doing vlogs, all tweets, all kinds of, my communication team have me doing all sorts of stuff. And it's really yielding results because I think that our passion for children, that the Generation Z that we're recruiting right now, they're adopting and adapting to that passion too. So up 15%, and we've tripled our STEM teachers at UK this year.
That's great to hear. I have one very strong impression about Kentucky. Several years ago, I was invited to speak to the Kentucky School Boards Association, and it was held at a big hotel. And when I went into the grand ballroom where there were all the school board members from across the state, in the outer lobby going into that grand ballroom, there were pennants and banners that had been created by schools in every single county and school district representing their community. And I walked around taking photographs. They were so beautiful. And it represented to me the deep feeling that the people of Kentucky have for their public schools. Right. It struck me as an organic relationship and one that's not easily severed. And I say this as I know that in Kentucky, the legislature passed charter school legislation to introduce competition into these rural communities that really don't want competition. And thus far, and correct me if I'm wrong, the legislature, having authorized charters, has been unable to put any funding into charters. So you actually have the legislation, but no money to open a charter. Is that correct?
I think you've told the story perfectly. Of course, I have to tippy-toe around this one. But I mean, I think folks know my work on charter schools. I think that Republicans and Democrats, there's growing doubts that charters are actually delivering what they said they would deliver. I think if you look across the research literature, whether it be segregation, whether it be student achievement, whether it be school discipline, if you look on average, the vast majority of peer-reviewed studies that look at these different topics say that charter schools have taken these challenges that we already have in our neighborhood public schools and actually accentuated them, and in many cases made them worse. That's what the predominance of the research says on those topics. And so, you know, I think that folks are pausing. They just hit the pause button. The charter schools have to go through districts here. I recollect that there was a charter application and the district said no. So at this time, I'm not aware of any schools in the state. And I'm going to tell you that Kentuckians are very, very proud, like you said, of their public schools. That's one of the things that really grabbed me when I first came to Kentucky. You know, coming from California, where there's more charters than anywhere else in the United States. And you go to visit the schools in communities across the state, and you see the lack of investment, especially in facilities and especially in communities of color. What really shocked me about the public schools here, especially in Lexington as I toured them, was I could see what it looked like when you didn't have funds being siphoned from neighborhood public schools and the kinds of investments that could be made in public schools when that was not occurring. That was really quite startling to me, coming from the California context to the Kentucky context. And Kentuckians are really proud of their history of education reform. They had a big education reform bill back in 1990. But I think it's high time that Kentucky have a new education reform bill that's focused on a suite of community-based approaches to education reform. There are conversations about community-based accountability here in Kentucky, similar to what's happening in Texas and in California. But I think that, like you said, Diane, people in Kentucky really treasure their schools. I think that's absolutely the case. And there's clearly needs here. You know, if you look at a lot of the metrics, funding, these sorts of things, we're in the bottom 10, bottom quintile of states. But there's also good news here. If you look at the percent of our students that are in STEM courses in this state, we're in the top quintile in terms of the nation. So it's really a good news, bad news story here. I think there's one other thing that Kentucky really needs to pay attention to. I want to bring this up, which is diversity. Almost a fourth of the students here are students of color, but diversity in terms of our teachers is at around 5%. Now, UK, we're at about 18% in terms of diversity, so we're doing okay. We're not doing as well as we should be doing. We've got to do better. And part of the challenge is that you have African-American boys are 3.4 times more likely to be suspended here. Students of color are 1.4 times less likely to be in AP courses. So there are also quite a few equity concerns here in Kentucky, but you know, my colleagues, myself, the other public institutes, colleges of education, and I should say this, the deans of the colleges of education meet quarterly here in Kentucky. So Kentucky's a big place, but it's also a small place. And so there's a lot of opportunity to make change. What I've been telling folks is I think there's an opportunity for Kentucky to be the Finland of the US. We're about that size, about 1 million students or so. I think there's a lot of opportunity, considering the history of reform here in this state, to take education policy in a different direction, to be that state that's a beacon of the things that we know work, those policies that are community engaged.
Well, that sounds like a wonderful opportunity for you. I was going to ask you if you might talk a bit about the research, the two areas that I'm most familiar with, actually three, and they're all interrelated. One is that you have written extensively about charter research, and two is you've written extensively about Teach for America. And the third, of course, is your very intense focus on equity. And all these are somehow related. So if you would you just talk a little bit about, or however long you want to talk about each of them and tell us what you've learned?
Well, you know, Teach for America and charter schools are almost synonymous. We found out recently that the Walton Foundation actually paid Teach for America extra money if they sent their recruits to charter schools. 1/3 of Teach for America recruits go into charter schools. For those of you that don't know what Teach for America is out there, it's a program that during a 5-week summer sends typically new college graduates, sometimes they can be a little older, but they're typically the minority, into situations where they teach typically out of subject in high needs schools and high needs areas. So we have a podcast called Truth for America, where we interview folks who are in TFA, or we interview principals or researchers, other folks that have interacted with TFA. We found, for example, you have folks going in to teach special ed in Los Angeles who never had any training on special ed, didn't know what an IEP was. And I think what's really challenging about this is that the schools never tell the parents of these special education children that these young folks that are assigned to special ed don't have any background or training in special education. And you see that across the spectrum. And sometimes you'll see a study here and there that says Teach for America is great. I could think of one from Mathematica. But so often those studies are highly limited. The Mathematica study only looked at secondary mathematics, and the teachers were primarily white in that study, and they only did modestly better, even with the deck stacked, about 0.05 or so. Now, if you look at things like, and that's a standard deviation, but if you think, and it's in that, it could be 0.06, but it's in the hundredths of a standard deviation, which is a number larger than 0, but it's basically 0. I'm sorry, I'm sounding like a stats professor right now. But here's the point. The point is that if you do things like class size reduction or high quality pre-K, you can get 100%, 200% more impact than you get from Teach for America. So if Teach for America tells you, well, we have a positive impact, they're not lying to you, but the impact is so small that you need a telescope to see it. We know from the research literature that there are other things that have a lot more impact than Teach for America does. So if I was a policymaker and I was thinking about making investments, because Teach for America, about 1/3 of their funds come from tax dollars, from states, and other localities, I would want to make those investments in education policies that have a bigger impact than Teach for America does. It's a similar challenge with charter schools. If you look at the research on charter schools, even if you look at Credo's study, Credo is a conservative think tank housed at Stanford University. And I think it's important to know a couple of things about Credo. The first is that Credo, when they compare charter schools to neighborhood schools, they're actually not comparing schools, they're comparing students that attend schools. That's a different thing. Second, they only compare students that are from schools that sent kids to charter schools. So they're not actually comparing all charter schools to all public schools. They're only comparing charter schools to a small subset of neighborhood schools, which partitions the normal curve, as you might expect. Again, sounding like a professor, but let me tell you in layman's terms, they're comparing apples to oranges. Now, even when they stack the deck, you again find a difference in the hundreds of a standard deviation. And then again, you would say to yourself, why don't we make investments in ed policies? Because that's what my PhD is in, ed policy analysis. That's what I've spent, I've written nearly 60 peer-reviewed chapters, law reviews, and other articles over the years as an academic. And so you would think that policymakers would want to make investments in approaches, education reforms, that were much more impactful than Teach for America or charter schools. The things that we know are the gold standards, like the class size reductions, like the high quality pre-K, those have 200-300% more impact than these other reforms. Still there?
Okay, I turned off my microphone because it's a cough and found myself muted and unable to unmute myself. I'm now unmuted. So where do you see Kentucky going into? You said that Kentucky could be the Finland of America, and I had to say that's a grand vision. That's a wonderful vision to have, because the state's the right size. The question is the money there, and is the will there in terms of the legislature? I know you have a wonderful new governor, but is the legislature one that's prepared to support kids? What's happening all over this country is that states are going, unless there's a dramatic new federal package of money for states, there's going to be huge budget cuts. And at first I was thinking, let's try to figure out how to mitigate the budget cuts. But now I think that's not the right approach to take. We should be demanding budget increases because of COVID and because of the suffering of schools and the suffering of the kids and the families, and the need for social distancing and the need for extra safety and health measures. Schools need more money, not less. There should be no more than 15 kids in a class. There should be extraordinary measures taken to protect children. And we shouldn't really think about negotiating about cuts that might be 30% or 20%. We should be getting increases of 20 or 30%, because this is a challenge to this country right now. Do we care about our children? Do we care about our future?
Yeah.
And I guess this is a hard question to ask you, but do you think that the legislature of Kentucky is prepared to say, we're going to invest more in our children, and we're not going to cut the schools, we're going to cut something else, we're going to raise taxes?
So I think as many folks probably know, we have
not paying the cost.
So I think as many folks probably know, we have a Democratic governor in a red state. Andy Beshear, his father served as governor, and he had a narrow win in the last election. And during that election, one of the main things he campaigned on was being the education governor. Now, I think COVID-19 has got in the way. Our governor does daily updates at 4 or 5 o'clock every day. And so, his administration is very focused. And if you look at the maps, Kentucky is usually not one of the red-coded states. Our governor has taken a lot of of steps to limit the spread of the virus. So he's been real focused on that. But his lieutenant governor is an educator. I don't know if a lot of people know that. Jacqueline Coleman is a principal, and she actually happens to be a doctoral student at the University of Kentucky College of Education. I don't know if folks knew that, but the lieutenant governor is serving on his cabinet, and they are very focused on education. And I think that we've got to be careful, though. If you think about Texas, for example, during the last recession, they cut $7 billion or $8 billion, depending on who's counting. Texas, even a decade later, hadn't put all the money back in the schools. And then you have, I'm hearing out of Texas today that the commissioner in Texas is saying that they're not going to give attendance monies to schools because students were online and they weren't actually in the building. I think that portends very bad things. I've heard that the budget in Kentucky is about 15% behind what they thought it was going to be. And so we're going to have to make some decisions. Are we going to continue our investment in K-12? I also have to throw higher education in there too. The legislature set a one-year budget here in Kentucky a few weeks ago, and they didn't make those cuts. So I think a lot of educators exhaled, but typically the budget is 2 years here and not 1 year. But the legislature left the education funding in place. And this is a super majority of Republicans. So I want to give those Republicans in the legislature kudos for making that commitment to the children and the students of this state. All the props to them for doing that. Because we see in other states that they're already starting to cut education. It's the first thing that they're thinking about cutting. So kudos to the governor, kudos to the Republican supermajority in the House and the Senate here for making that commitment, at least for the foreseeable future, to education in Kentucky. I think that that's a real positive, and I don't think that that's really on many people's radar nationally, that Kentucky committed to spend the money on education for this next year.
Yeah, that's very impressive. One of the things that we learned from our good friend, Reverend Charles Foster Johnson in Texas, was that rural Republicans are committed to their public schools. And whereas their National Republican Party has gone along with the Betsy DeVos agenda, the state legislators who are from rural areas are very much tied into their communities. And they understand that the public school is the mainstay of their community. And they know that it's the place where the sports teams and the debate teams and the kids are their kids. You know, their children went to those schools, and they really understand that they don't want to have vouchers. They don't want to have charters. They want to support public schools. So there is a coalition there, which a few states have recognized. What struck me about Texas, though, was that after the legislature cut something like $5.3 billion out of the public schools, and as you know, they have, that was, I think was in 2011, they have not yet restored, even though the costs have gone up and the number of students have gone up, they have yet to restore the money that they cut. And it's my belief that the problem is that the kids are majority minority, and the legislature is a lot of white men. And these are not their children. And they don't see their responsibility to the children in the state because they're Hispanic and they're Black and they're not their children. I can't think of another reason for disinvesting in the young people who are going to become who will be the owners of the state, the leaders of the state in another 10, 15, 20 years. But I hope that Kentucky is different.
Yeah. I think it's pretty clear now. For some time, you had these school finance lawsuits, and they would bring out the same cast of characters, many of them Diane, that would say, money doesn't matter in education. But I think it's pretty clear if you go into your local grocery store and you want to buy a pizza, and the quality of the pizza is related to how much you spend on that pizza. And so, you have work out of Northwestern, really interesting work that shows looking at reform on school finance relative to student achievement. that those states that improve funding improve their achievement over the long term. So you have a bevy of studies also that look at the impact on the state budget when you invest in high quality pre-K, because we spend less on social services, we spend less on police and incarceration for those children that receive a high quality education. So you see this really controversial conversation right now about defund the police. Now, for some people, that is, we're just going to abolish the police departments and start over. For other people, it's how do we redirect some of the funding that we're spending on SROs in schools? You know, when LA Unified received a big chunk of money, they spent quite a bit of that on new police officers, new SROs, instead of librarians and other things that matter. And so my mother always told me, show me how you spend your money and I'll show you what your priorities are. And so making those investments in education, defunding other things in our budget that are less important to us, ultimately, when you do the cost benefit analysis down the road, making those investments in our citizens is economically wise. There's research study after research study that demonstrates that. So when we're talking about defunding different parts of the state budget, I think the idea is that we redirect those funds to places that we know that those funds are going to have a bigger impact and that are preventative and restorative instead of punitive. So when I'm thinking about this whole conversation about defund, I really think it should be redirect. Redirect these funds to the things that we know are impactful in kids' lives and ultimately set them up for their future.
Well, someone sent me a link today to, I guess it was in Los Angeles, that the school police force there actually owns military grade equipment. And it's astonishing. I assume that they weren't given this. It's possible the Defense Department gave them whatever rocket propelled grenades and tanks and rocket launchers and stuff that's absolutely ridiculous. But clearly there's a need to rethink the whole approach to discipline and how this bears on equity. And I assume this is something you've given a lot of thought to, which is how do you deal with discipline problems in school without involving armed police or guys in uniforms, but rather, as you put it earlier, I think, directing it towards peer-mediated decision-making involving kids in discipline processes that are not punitive and that do not mark them as criminals and put them on the path to a life in prison, which is what we all don't want.
Yeah. You know, I think one of the big challenges with policing and policing that we see in our schools is the escalation. The equipment that escalates the situation. I think many of us watched in horror as you had protests in the streets. Most times they were peaceful protests. Then you had responses that were, I think the best way you can characterize them, exhibited some brutality. I think that's a real challenge. And I think you can Google and see situations online where you have cops in schools body slamming small children, middle schoolers, teens. It's the escalation that I think we've really got to address in policing. I myself, as a person of color, I've experienced escalation from police in Texas and many other states. I've had to be the calm one in those situations. Many people don't know that about me. I've had these conversations in private before, but I've had police officers try to escalate situations with me many times in my life. And so how do we train police officers? How do we train SROs to deal and de-escalate these situations? Now, that being said, you saw the police officer, the Wendy's situation in Atlanta. He had 9 hours of de-escalation training before that event happened. So I can understand the other side of that argument that it's not all about de-escalation, but I think we need to think about what would we rather spend those monies on and how can we have restorative practices? We were talking a little bit about community-based accountability. And I want to talk a little bit about this because about 8 years ago, I was on an airplane coming back from an APAM conference in Rome, and I wanted a new idea that was community-based. How could we do accountability in a way that was bottom up? You know, Steve Jobs once said that good ideas are lots of ideas, good ideas stolen from other places made into a new idea. I'm paraphrasing. And so I thought of how do we create strategic approaches on the community level, and how do we do it in a way that communities could prioritize what's important to them? Because at the time, accountability was AYP, adequate yearly progress, it was test scores, it was dropout rates, and that was about it. So how do we do this in a multiple measure approach that empowers communities? Why am I talking about this in relation to SROs and escalations and these sorts of things? Because in California, when they implemented local accountability, so when I first came up with this idea, I gave the idea to Linda Darling-Hammond, and she shared that idea with policymakers in California and other folks, public advocates and John Ethel and other folks. And that approach became what's now called the LCAPs, local accountability, where communities get together and make plans to address what they feel is important. And the state provides extra monies to execute those strategic accountability plans. So there's goals in those plans, and they may include test scores, but there's other things that they include, like reducing the suspension rates. And how do you address that with targeted monies? So you have places like Oakland and Long Beach and other places that in their LCAPs, which are their local accountability plans, invested and set goals for reducing suspensions. And if you look across California, suspensions are down by several 100,000 since they started this approach. And so I think these solutions have community solutions, because as we change the paradigm about what's important in schools and what's important to communities, reducing suspensions, in-school suspensions and out-of-school suspensions, addressing the challenges that kids have in restorative ways so that they don't get involved in the justice system early on in their life because of a bad interaction with a school resource officer, an SRO. That's in the best interest of our communities. And I think when communities are empowered to make decisions about what's important to them, test scores is not at the top of their list. And so when you sit down with communities and ask them, what are the things that your schools should be delivering for your children? School discipline and restorative approaches to behavior for their children is on that list. And so I think we have to be driven by public policy that is focused on restorative approaches, community engaged approaches to addressing the challenges that we have with school discipline.
You know, Julian, when we talk about police in schools, I keep thinking about a video that was very widely shared on social media a few years ago. And I forget where it happened, but there was a kid, maybe 12 or 13 years old, a young Black girl who was sitting in her chair. A policeman told her to get up, and she didn't. And he ordered her to get up, and she didn't. And he grabbed her by the hair and pulled her chair over, knocked her to the floor, and dragged her out of the classroom by her hair. And I think that was absolutely, you know, it's chilling. It's chilling. It was chilling to watch then. It's chilling to think about now. And it's stuck in my head. But I wonder, I mean, clearly there has to be a better way. I've come to the conclusion there should not be police in schools, period. There has to be a better way. And I've heard people talk about restorative justice, and as you did now, and as I understand it, and I'd like you to talk a bit more about it, it involves young people basically being the judges of other young people and saying, you don't do this, and this is what we think you should do instead. And the young person who got into trouble is more willing to listen to their peers correcting them than they are to having a cop yank them by the hair and drag them out of the classroom.
Yeah.
But if you could talk a bit about restorative justice, I think it would help all of us understand it better.
Yeah, so what restorative justice does is it says that in the process of healing, that it restores the student and is not punitive. So it's a growth, inner growth opportunity for that student. So the case that you're talking about is the youth courts. That's one form of restorative justice. And so I've written a couple of pieces about the youth court that Webb Middle School had. And in that case, you had kids who were involved in infractions that were not automatic suspensions. We, of course, know there are some things that are automatic suspensions. Those include drugs, weapons, and a few other things. But those are typically 3%. They're a very small percentage of the suspensions that happen. Most suspensions that happen in school are sort of subjective decisions that are made. I had a student who studied this, Rebecca Cohen, and she found out that, for example, if you suspend a student who's truant, guess what happens? That student becomes more truant. And so suspensions are not the best approach. And so restorative approach is understanding what's going on with that kid's life. Now, it could be, and this is a true story that I heard from a student in one of my fieldwork in one of my studies. The reason why the student was truant was because she was in high school, but her brother had gotten in trouble in middle school, and her mom was working 2 jobs, and so she had to stay home with her brother, who had been suspended in middle school. But then that got her into trouble and behind, and then she was suspended, and then it spiraled for her, and she became a dropout. So what restorative practices do is they address the challenges that the kids are having. And with the youth court, you have these kids involved, you have a judge, you have a jury, you have a defendant, a prosecuting attorney. And with the youth court, when we studied it in Austin, Texas, we found that kids were less likely to commit similar offenses when they are involved with this youth court, because like you said, their peers held them accountable. And then once they were adjudicated in this youth court, then that child who had been the defendant would in a future youth court become the judge. There are many other forms of restorative justice. Many people are aware of restorative circles, etc. But the idea is, how do we address the challenges that kids have? What is going on in their lives and inside them that is related to that maladaptive behavior? And so that's what restorative justice does, but it requires expertise. It requires restorative justice coordinators. In their LCAP, I remember Oakland spent $1 million on addressing restorative justice in their district. It was a big commitment that they made to this approach. And so that's the alternative. And that's a community-based, community-driven approach. Instead of bringing the cops from outside, the police from outside your campus, within your community, you find ways to restore that child and address the behavior that caused them to act out. And you need expert teachers to address that behavior. We know that teachers who have less experience and who receive very little background, so if you're a Teach for America teacher, during the summer, they have a little headset while you're in the classroom training, and they're telling you how to discipline kids because they don't have the training that they would have had at UK or Harvard or Berkeley or any other college of education to understand how to deal with student behavior. And so it's important that we have highly trained teachers and we make investments in restorative justice, because when you have novice teachers, these are the results. The results are they aren't able to manage the classroom and deal with the challenges that the kids of today bring to school.
So I would assume that when dealing with discipline issues, that peer pressure is far more powerful than a threatening policeman, because a threatening policeman causes angry and resistant and defensive, whereas kids react to peer pressure. That's just the nature of teenagers. They don't want to disappoint their peers.
Yeah.
Does that operate in restorative justice?
That's a good question. I think in the case of the youth court, that's absolutely one of the things that underlies that approach. I think highly qualified teachers, mentors, capable school leaders, principals, I think all of those, and the research literature supports that, they're going to be able to better address the needs of a child than a police officer. A police officer is not trained in the necessary techniques to deal with an 11-year-old child who has who knows what's going on with her life. I saw that video too, Diane, and it made my blood boil that a police officer would bully an 11-year-old girl like that and slam her to the ground. I can't think of anything that that child could have done to deserve that action. I can't think of any. And if you go to YouTube, there's many examples of this. This is a very common occurrence where you have this type of situation, a very young child interacting with an officer and something very bad happening to the child. I can't think of anything that would deserve that kind of action that I see in that video. So I think we've got to do better. I think the peer piece is important, as we see in the youth court, highly capable educators, restorative justice coordinators, highly capable educational leaders. Those are much better places to make investments than research SROs. And this has actually been one of our challenges in Kentucky. The legislature is very determined here to have SROs in classrooms. I think that's something that we need to take a more careful look at. We need to rethink that. We need to make more research available on alternative approaches for policymakers. And I think that's on us as academics. We've got to be a part of that public discourse. We need to make sure that peer-reviewed research, that civil rights organizations have access to that work, that educators and activists, policymakers, we dropped the ball on that. We need to make that work more available because, that making, I'm trying to think of the right word, requiring SROs in classrooms, I don't think is the most effective or empirical route to addressing school discipline.
So, Julian, taking it to the other extreme, what does the research show us or tell you about the efficacy of the no excuses approach, which is very, very popular amongst some of the high-performing charter schools?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's popular among the high-performing charter schools. I mean, one of the things, KIPP is one of these schools. And many years ago, I have a buddy, he's Teach for America, and some of his Teach for America colleagues were running one of the KIPP charter schools. Of course, KIPP was started by several Teach for America alums. And they approached my colleague and said, hey, we're having a hard time keeping African-American students at KIPP, discipline, and they leave, and it's just, we're not able to do it. Would you come out here and study why this is happening? Well, we said, of course, as long as we can publish a peer-reviewed study, you'll be anonymous, nobody will know who you are, but publish or perish. We were both junior faculty at the time. And so we went out there, we met with them. I couldn't believe I was on a KIPP campus, but I was there. And so we went back, we started to plan what that study was going to look like. And then KIPP went on Oprah at some point that summer, and they talked about how great they were doing with African-American children. And I thought to myself, but KIPP just reached out to us and said that they were having challenges. So KIPP came back after the Oprah and said, well, you can come and study us, but you can't publish it. You could do the study, but which of course didn't make sense for us. So we didn't do the study. But then I asked myself the question, my mother always said, where there's smoke, there's fire. So I looked into this. I went to the Texas data. And at the time, the data we had was on KIPP Houston. And I found that 40% of African Americans were leaving KIPP for all different reasons. Some of them discipline, no excuses stuff, because as you know, to remain in KIPP, you have to agree to their parent contract, their student contract. And if you don't do that, then they'll counsel you out and say, you're just not the right fit for KIPP. So they're basically able to select their students using these no excuses policies. And what that resulted in was 40% of African American students. And I published a study in the Berkeley Review of Education. It's an online journal, so you can take a look at the study yourself. We looked across the state of Texas at other charter schools and found similar trends, that African Americans were more likely to leave charter schools, and oftentimes related to this no excuses discipline. And so at the time, KIPP was saying that they had a 100% graduation rate for African Americans. But really that's only 100% of 60%, which to me does not add up to 100%. And I went to your talk in Houston, Diane, when you're with Feinberg at Rice University, and you spoke a lot of truth about KIPP, even though they had invited you. And this is what I talked about a little bit earlier, is that we already have challenges with with discipline and suspensions, especially of Black boys and brown boys and brown and Black girls too. And yet, if you look at just about every peer-reviewed study, you're going to find that charter schools have higher expulsion and suspension rates for African Americans and Latinx students. So in this case, what the No Excuses does is it takes a challenge that we already have in negative public schools, and on average makes it worse. Now, that's not an indictment of every charter school. I think a lot of folks have favorite charter schools, but if you look across, and a lot of times there's, you know, community-based charter school. For example, there were some Hawaiians that, I don't know if it was an MPE conference or another, were talking about their charter school in Hawaii, and that they planned to close their charter school as soon as the local schools adopted more Hawaiian practices. So they had opened their school to model practices, Hawaiian practices, to the local public school, and they planned to close. It wasn't, how can we create a competing system that's privately managed? How can we get, talking about idea charter schools in Texas right now, can we get a suite at the Spurs game? Can we get a private jet? Can we fly first class? It wasn't that kind of a charter school. It was very focused on being, it was ethnically diverse, focused on Hawaiians very specifically. So yeah, I think that, you know, the No Excuses is just one example. Segregation is another. You know, we did a study. I looked at the Common Core data, the NCES Common Core data, and we found that if you look across the United States, looking at all the Common Core data, that charter schools are more segregated than public schools. Now, you would expect that, because if you think about Milton Friedman in the 1950s, when he started talking about school choice, he said that school choice would allow us to essentially have schools that were mostly Black, mostly white, or mixed, or that we could essentially gerrymander our schools by race using school choice. That, and if you think about the context of the 1950s, the reason for that is that it was Brown versus Board. And so you had segregation academies, which is related to vouchers and other things. And so they created this school choice because they didn't like busing and they didn't like the desegregation, and they wanted to be able to keep students of different backgrounds separate. So this idea that choice is a civil right, I mean, this is an idea that was retrograded on an idea that was actually originally designed to create separation between people of different backgrounds. So nowadays, we see that, you know, there's several studies that say that African Americans are more likely to choose a charter school that's more segregated than the one that they were attending. White's the same. It's a little bit more mixed for Latinx folks. And so you have charter schools more segregated. Now, there are some people that argue that the reason why charter schools are more segregated is because of the neighborhoods that they sit in. So we looked at this in the study that we published. I think it was the Journal of Educational Sciences. It's on my blog if you'd like to read this peer-reviewed study. So we controlled by census tract demographics. And even when you control for community demographics, we found that charter schools are, I think it was 2 or 3% more segregated, statistically significant across the United States. So a lot of these challenges, whether they be school discipline, segregation, et cetera, have been accentuated in charter schools. And I think that's why that you see Republicans in DC and other places, they seem to be more, and this is just what I've been noticing, I don't know if this is actually the case, but I feel like as I look across the landscape, the Republicans seem to be focusing more on vouchers now than charter schools. I think you see the Democratic Party focusing more on community schools and neighborhood schools instead of charter schools. And so that's sort of left charter schools in this, like you look at Cory Booker, he's talking less about vouchers, less about charter schools. I think that maybe it was Rick Hess or Mike Petrelli said that education reform has now become partisan. So I think you see these fault lines appearing, and charter schools are caught somewhere in the middle, it seems.
Thank you both. I'd like to give everyone who's viewing an opportunity to speak with both of you via Darcy. She'll be channeling their questions. Darcy, if you could tell us what's on the minds of the folks who are listening in today.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. The first question for you guys is from Sarah Gump. She's a K-12 teacher in Kentucky, and she wants to know what you're thinking about teaching and providing equitable education during the pandemic. And she's wondering about this both for the students at the University of Kentucky and how you're preparing those future educators to teach in this environment.
So those are three really big questions. So first, I am going to teach a class next month. And I think it's going to be titled, How Did We Get Here? So we'll look at where education reform has come from and where education reform is right now. And then where are we going? What should we be doing? How should we be approaching? Everybody's wondering what's next. Now that we know that charter schools haven't delivered as we thought they would, or some people thought they would, now that we know that No Child Left Behind didn't make every child proficient by 2014, we're in this area of what's next. So that's the course I'm going to teach next month. It'll meet 4 times for 2 hours. It's in our professional learning series. There are several other courses. Cheryl Matias is coming, and she's going to be teaching about the representation of race in media. So there's quite a few really interesting courses. Typically, academics don't teach courses for the general public. So you don't have to enroll in our PhD program or our master's program. You'll be able to take courses from our top faculty for a very small fee. I think it's around $100 this summer. It's something we're piloting. I've never taught a course for the general public, so I'm really looking forward to doing that. The next question is, how do we promote equity? You know, if you think about what's happened with the pandemic, it used to be that high-speed internet and Wi-Fi and devices, those were luxuries. But now they're absolute requirements. And UK, when we handed out iPads in the fall to every student, there was a little bit of an outcry. There was some pushback. But our students were able to seamlessly move into online instruction. Now, this, through our teacher ed work, into quite a bit of challenge because, as you know, the onset of COVID-19 happened quite rapidly. But we have a really strong team. Margaret Moore-Schroeder and Jared Stanlis and several other folks that are leading our teacher ed folks here came up with a plan that was multimodal, including a variety of different online platforms, continuing to work with their mentor teachers, doing some teaching online. So we had a multimodal approach to this. Now, and for the fall, right now, Kentucky is planning to be in person. And we're gathering the PPE and developing the policies and practices to do that. We don't know what's going to happen with the pandemic this summer, but the plan is right now that we'll be in person. And if that's the case, and the districts locally have assured us that we'll be able to send our teachers into schools as of right now. That's the plan right now. But we do have a plan B that looks similar to what we did in the spring for our student teachers. I'm going to tell you, you know, we've talked about Teach for America and their challenges and their lack of training. 97% of districts tell us that they feel that the teachers that we train are highly qualified, 97%. And the joke that I like to tell is that the other 3% are Louisville fans, which is our big rival just up the highway about an hour. So our teachers are well received. Almost 90% of our teachers that we train this year are already hired. Only about 10% are still on the market, and we're still several months from the fall. So, but we know we've got to do better. I talked a little bit about the increases in STEM teachers. Training 10 STEM teachers a year is just not sustainable. So we're really proud that we were able to triple what we're doing on that front. But we know we've got to be tuned in because the pandemic can accentuate the inequities, especially the inequities that are related to parents that have to have 2 or 3 jobs, technology challenges. So we're working with school districts, and there's a big production related to feeding students. Districts in Kentucky are typically high poverty districts, and so they provide meals. So there's all these logistics that go into this work. So we're absolutely committed in working with activists, with civil rights, with policymakers, with school districts. We understand that as academics, it's our sacred responsibility to ensure that we're training teachers, that those teachers are prepared to teach in a diverse world. We think we're doing well, but we know we must do better.
So if I can just join in a second, I think that what we've learned, among other things during this period, is that the internet should be free for everyone. We should not have to pay for a service provider. It should be like radio. When you get into your car, you turn on the radio and you don't pay anybody to turn on the radio. It's free. And the internet should be as free as the radio is. Supplying the devices, nobody gives out radios for free as far as I know. But I think that the access in the highway should not have any cost at all. It should be a public utility available to everybody.
I agree.
And I think that in terms of where we go from here, I'm hoping that after the next election, that we will have a Secretary of Education who brings a very different vision of what education can be and should be from the one that we've been suffering under for the past 20 years. The one thing that we can say with certainty, and you mentioned this, Julian, in your remarks, is that No Child Left Behind was a failure. Race to the Top was a failure. The Common Core has not fulfilled any of its promises. And we have been through 20 years of one bad idea after another, imposed either by a billionaire like Bill Gates or the Congress influenced by Bill Gates. And it's time to stop experimenting on children and to really look to different practices and a different purpose. And my own goal would be to have schools that had a well-rounded approach to education and that were child-centered and were focused on building children to be the best they can be, wherever they are, whoever they are, to give them the most we can and the best we can. And forget about the test scores. If we want to know how our state compares to some other state, look at NAEP. We don't need to test every child every year. There's no high-performing nation in the world that does that, and we shouldn't do it either.
Okay, thank you so much to both of you. I'm sorry, Julian, did you have something else you wanted to add again?
Well, I just want to add this real quick, that, whether you're a Republican or Democrat, you have to hold your policymakers accountable for education. When you do polls of voters, if you ask them what issues are most important to you, and you don't prompt them, typically education is going to be in the top 5 things that they care about. Now, if you prompt folks in a call, then it's less likely to be one of the top 10. But if you ask voters, and so I think that we have got to hold our policymakers accountable. We have to be education voters. And we have to express to our legislators how important education is, specifically public education is. It's the compass of our democracy. Education is the compass of our democracy. And now more than ever, when there's all sorts of misinformation flying all different directions, we need an educated citizenry to sort through all the disinformation. So education is the compass of our democracy. We must be education voters.
All right, well, Julian, you just gave me the perfect lead-in for one of the questions that we have. If you had the opportunity to sit down and speak with Joe Biden for half an hour, what would you tell him?
Great question. I've had the honor of working as a volunteer policy advisor for Gavin Newsom, a volunteer policy advisor for Barack Obama in the 2008 campaign, of course, because Leonard Darling Hammond was doing that work at the time, working with legislators in Texas and California and many other states. It's work that I'm really committed to. What I would tell him is that what people are craving for is for communities to be the center of education policy and education reform, and to adopt an approach of community-based education reform, reform that is community engaged, community relevant, and sees communities as the source of this work rather than the problems with this work. So that's where, if I was to talk to him, I would lay out the case for community-based accountability. I would lay out the case for community-driven assessments of teacher success. I would lay out the case for community schools, community districts. That's what I would lay out. And I would lay out the research, the empirical knowledge that we know for each of those policies, and make the case that Linda Darling-Hammond should be Secretary of Education. That's what I would do.
Okay, if the question is addressed to me, I would say, number one, almost 90% of the kids in this country go to public schools. The public schools are in serious trouble, not because they have bad teachers, because they don't, but because they are dealing with the social problems of a very deeply inequitable society. And the schools should be, the funding for the schools, this is something only the federal government can do, and that is the funding should be dramatically increased. I would return the federal law to its original purpose in 1965, which is equitable funding. The federal government in 1965 did not tell anyone to test every child. It did not tell anyone how to run schools. It knew that Washington, D.C. didn't know how to run schools. What it did know was that Washington, D.C. could raise the money and provide the money to underfunded schools so that they had a crack at improving the education of children. So I would restore the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. I would call it that. I would not call it No Child Left Behind. I would not call it the Every Student Succeeds Act. I would not call it the Pie in the Sky Act for Education. I would call it the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, with a focus on funding special education as Congress promised when it passed that law, and funding the schools that enroll the neediest kids, and funding a decrease in class size across the nation. And I would defund the charter schools program, which was started as a small pilot program during the Clinton administration in 1994 with the idea of helping mom and pop startups, but which has since grown into a $440 million a year slush fund that Betsy DeVos uses to give to KIPP and to IDEA, which is the charter chain that wanted to hire a private jet for its executives. That has to go. The money has to go where the kids are, which is in public schools. And there should be a public role of funding where the needs are greatest. And that's what the federal government should do, and eliminate the mandate on testing altogether, and let states decide how they wish to test.
Okay, well, we have another question from Judy Fay, who is a retired teacher and a current board member. And she wants to know what you guys would suggest for evaluating students when they return to school after the pandemic, both academically and social emotional. And she said that she's speaking up in her district about the use of iReady or MAP testing, but that she's not getting a lot of support for that in her district. So she could use some advice from both of you.
Well, gosh, the first crack at it, I'd say the thing that kids need least of all is a new round of standardized testing. These tests have been proven to be unreliable, invalid, and what they have no diagnostic value whatever. They're simply saying, can you guess the right answer to the questions that the test makers have come up with? And that's not what kids need. Kids have been out of school for months. They need social and emotional support. They need play, they need activity, they need socialization, and they need a reintroduction to the structures of learning in a way that engages them and not in a way that says, you're here to be tested. So fight as hard as you can against the MAP test, against the iReady test, against all of these standardized tests, because they are simply not diagnostic, although they claim to be, they're not. They're a waste of money, a waste of time, and try to imagine and follow through on your instincts about doing what's right for children and helping them become curious, energetic, and creative learners.
So what Diane said, I completely in agreement with what she said. And I think the other thing to think about here is that if you think about No Child Left Behind, what it really did is, one of its biggest accomplishments was privatizing assessment. So what it did is it took the summative and formative assessment, the meaningful work that our educators do, and handed it over to Pearson, along with hundreds of millions of dollars. So I think that those high stakes tests, they're at about 10,000 feet. You know, they might be 60 questions for a particular section. They're not very exact. If you ask educators, they might take a look at them in the spring after they come back, maybe the fall. They're not specific enough to really provide input to parents either. It's the educators that can provide the specific summative and formative assessment that's valuable to the school, that's valuable to the parents. Think about the conversations that you have with your teachers in parent-teacher conferences and the kinds of definition that they can provide about a child's learning. That's where we need to be focused. In Kentucky, about 10% of our teachers are novice teachers. About 90% of them are experienced. We want to trust our experienced educators to do the formative and summative assessment and express that to the school, express that to the students, express that to the families, and express that to the district. That's where we get the finest grain and most accurate assessment of where students are.
Great. Thanks to both of you for those very specific answers, and I hope that's helpful. So we have a question from Tiffany Dunn, who says she's with Save Our Schools Kentucky. And it's a question that Julian maybe is kind of directed at you and kind of asks you to put a finer point on something that you kind of touched on a little bit earlier. She says, President Trump is recycling rhetoric, saying school choice is a civil rights issue of our time. How do we combat that manipulation, particularly in Kentucky, where we have a predominantly white legislature?
So I want to tippy toe around this one because in my current role, I work very hard to be nonpartisan. Some of you may have noticed that change in my blog. But let me say this. What do civil rights organizations have to say about school choice? If you look at the NAACP, which is the nation's largest and oldest civil rights organization, they've had several national resolutions on school choice. They've had resolutions on vouchers. They've had resolutions on charters. In fact, back in 2016, when the NAACP passed the charter school moratorium, that was the third resolution that the NAACP had voted on at the National Convention, asking for reform of charter schools and calling in 2016 for a pause. If you look at Journey for Justice, which is a grassroots civil rights organization led by Jitu, who I believe was on this same podcast very recently, they have the same position. They call for a moratorium on school choice. If you look at the Movement for Black Lives, which was a conference that met a few years ago and discussed this topic, they also called. So now I understand that President Trump has taken the position that school choice equals civil rights. But if you ask civil rights organizations, they appear to have a different opinion on the matter.
So I don't have to be politic because I'm not the dean of the College of Education at the University of Kentucky. Julian alluded to the origins of school choice, and I think it's important to remember this. There was a book and an article that recently was written by Stephen Suitts, S-U-I-T-T-S, of the Southern Education Foundation, in which he went through the history of school choice. And the history of school choice is that it came from racist Southern governors who did not want to integrate their schools. And so they advocated for school choice so that white kids could go to white schools and black kids would be afraid to go to white schools and they would go to black schools. And this school choice was intended to cement segregation by choice rather than by court order. And the courts threw out every single school choice plan because they knew that its purpose was segregation. So this is the history of school choice, is that it is rooted in segregation, in racial segregation specifically. We also know that in practice, in countries like Sweden and in Chile and others that have programs of school choice, it has in fact had a segregative impact, that is, segregated children by race, by religion, by income, by social status, by every kind of dimension you can imagine. School choice is certainly not the civil rights issue of our time. It never was a civil rights issue. It's opposed to civil rights. And the civil rights issue of our time is civil rights. The right to vote without intimidation, the right to vote without voter suppression, the right to be treated fairly and equitably by law enforcement, the right to have a decent standard of living. You can come up with all sorts of ways in which civil rights mean equality. They don't mean school choice, because school choice is not the civil rights issue of our time. Civil rights is the civil rights issue of our time. And we still have not, as we have seen in the last several weeks, with hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating across the nation. They're demonstrating against racism, they're demonstrating against police brutality, and they're demonstrating for a very different approach to equity, which is to say equity means equity, and it doesn't mean disparate treatment based on your race. And they're certainly not demonstrating for school choice, they're demonstrating for civil rights. And that's the issue of our day.
Well, we have another interesting follow-up question that I think ties in nicely with what you were both just talking about. It's another question from Judy Fay, our retired teacher and now board member, who wants to know if either of you have any resource suggestions for K-12 for teaching social justice history. She says she has some standards from Teaching Tolerance, the Teaching Tolerance Anti-Bias Framework, and also Joe Tress's Coronavirus Cross-Cultural Project. And are there any other resources that you can suggest?
So, social justice history. So I think one, I was really honored to be a part of the planning for the new Black Studies course in Texas. Texas now has a statewide course on Black Studies. So I think that's one place you can look. There's a set of standards now in Texas which started as a social justice leadership course in Dallas School District, Dallas ISD. Dale Allender, who was a professor at Sacramento State, that's ALLNDER, he also has a new textbook out on social justice education. So I would check out his text too. And I think you said that you were in Kentucky. You can send me an email afterwards at j.vh@uky.edu, and I'll connect you with a couple of our faculty that focus on that work. Next month, like I mentioned earlier in the call, we're gonna have a professional learning series, and several of our faculty will be addressing social justice in the curriculum in that learning series too. So I can connect you with those faculty. So those are a couple. I would take a look at the statewide standards that you see in Texas. I would take a look at the text by Dale Allender from Sacramento State. And then I can connect you with some of our faculty here at UK College of Education that can liaise with you also.
Well, there are lots of resources and it's hard to know where to begin. But I would think that one place might be the recent publication, the 1619 Project, which was in the New York Times Magazine, which is really a Black history in the United States. And Hannah Jones, who was one of the speakers at our NPE conference, is one of the writers or editors of that project. And that was a very sweeping look at Black history. And I would think that that would be something that would be a good starting place. It's called the 1619 Project.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in tonight. I'm going to throw in one more resource for you, and that's Jesse Ugobian in Washington has done a lot of wonderful work. And he has a book out, Teaching for Black Lives. And I think that's a wonderful resource as well. Julian, thank you so much. Kentucky is so lucky to have you there, though it is a big loss for California for sure. And Diane, thank you again for so generously sharing your evening with us. And we hope to see you soon. I think we're probably going to be taking a break next Wednesday, but we will have someone come back to speak with Diane to be announced soon the following Wednesday after that. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Julian. And thank you,
everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.